at like franchises that made sort of some major pivots. The biggest one that comes to mind, and thankfully everyone on the stream will understand what I'm talking about. Well, at least not necessarily the audience, but you guys will. When Star Trek the Motion Picture came out in 1979, right? It did not come out with the critical, reaction was mixed. The fan reaction was very mixed. A lot of people just saying Star Trek the Motion Picture was boring. I look fondly back on it because it reminds me of just being a young nerd in school and loving all Star Trek stuff. But they made a major pivot and said, look, audiences don't love this. They do not love this. We have to change things. So they brought in Harv Bennett, a TV producer, and said, all right, we're going to do a hard pivot. It's going to be action. It's going to be drama. There's going to be romance, all the things that weren't in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Okay. Yeah. Which a lot of people, call that movie Star Trek the Motionless Picture because it's slow. I will say I do really like it.
I have a newfound respect for it as I'm older because it is, along with part 5, 1 and 5 are probably the 2 movies that could work as one of the episodes of the series.
Right. But so they brought in Harv Bennett for Star Trek 2. Then they made Wrath of Khan, right? Then of course Star Trek as a movie franchise became obsessed with the villain. We got to have a good villain for this show. We got to have a good villain for this episode or this movie, whatever. It kind of sucks because it got him into that mindset. And I think that killed the trying to recapture what Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan did is why the Star Trek movies are just so stale in terms of the creativity. It was like, who's the villain of this movie? That would be like the first question. It's because, because Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan did so well. And not only that, people forget that is what made home video a thing, that movie. Because previous to Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan, all movies were what they call like the pricing was like $109.95 MSRP in 1980s dollars. Okay. Yeah. And they did an experiment with Star Trek 2. They called it sell-through pricing. Own it, bring it home, right? This was the first time they did this. This was in the mid 80s. And I believe the retail price, the MSRP was $39.95 or $29.95. What was it?
I think it was 29. And here's the thing on that one. I've been trying to find that because I think that might have been a re-release, even though it was still a brand new movie at the time, because the best I can find as far as records, the first run sell-through live action film was Top Gun, which would have been close to that era, Chris. Because what they did, from what I could found, was what they did is they released Paramount released 3 movies as a sell-through. It was Wrath of Khan, Beverly Hills Cop.
Top Gun.
No, this was before Top Gun even existed.
Oh, wow.
But these movies had already been out for just a small amount of time because this was early 85, Chris? It had to be it had to be late 85 because of Beverly Hills Cop.
I worked at a video store when this happened. We couldn't keep it in stock to sell. People were just coming in and buying the movie. They were buying the movie, and then it was pretty much a rental business. Everything was just rental only. You'd have these collectors that would spend $100 to get a copy of Superman, right? Like I was one of those people, by the way, or Superman 2. So like, but Star Trek 2,
maybe it was Star Trek 2 and 3. I can't remember. Yeah. Was it Star Trek 2 and 3?
No, it was just Star Trek 2. But what I'm just telling you is that changed the market. It changed everything. And the reason I bring this up is that we're looking at the Rings of Power. I'm checked out. I don't care. I don't have hate for the show. I have only apathy, and I don't like the lead character. And every time the Harfoots are on screen, I'm bored as hell. So, but what I'm saying is a hard pivot is what a lot of franchises could use at this point. I think Marvel needs a hard pivot. I don't see them doing it because I think they're just too stubborn. I think that Amazon, if they're going to continue with the Rings of Power, it's going to be a hard pivot to a more experienced producer who knows television. They're going to change even the rollout of it. You're going to see heads are going to roll. I think you're going to see a way hard pivot to like, okay, if we're committed to a season 2, make it a show people want to watch. Make it a show people want to watch. I still think it goes down as the biggest disaster in television history unless they do a hard pivot, and that's going to take some balls on an executive level to just say make it happen. Bring in some big guns, an experienced EP or showrunner. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I feel like the example, and look, we're still talking about Star Trek. If they didn't make that hard pivot and they just made more movies that were like Star Trek, the motion picture, we wouldn't be talking about Star Trek now. It might have killed the franchise. There may have never been a Star Trek, The Next Generation. And what I'm saying is, when are these executives going to grow a pair and do a hard pivot, or at least lean into the things that audiences want? And they want Henry Cavill as Superman. And there's a way to do a hard pivot with Man of Steel to a Man of Steel 2 that would preserve the things that we liked about Man of Steel, right? I like the cast. With the exception of Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor, I like the cast. But it's funny because when you look back at Star Trek 2, they ignore the fact that Star Trek, the motion picture, ever happened. Literally, there's no mention of it. There's no they changed the wardrobe, and the stylings of things. They changed so many things going into Star Trek 2 from Star Trek, the motion picture, that it wouldn't surprise me that, look, if we're going to hard pivot, let's hard pivot to things that people want to see. And basically what Harv Bennett did is, I'm going to get back to like what people liked about the original series. And then he did a direct connection to the original series, a sequel to Space Seed, and made it all like go back and watch Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan. It was just in theaters. It may in fact still be playing in some theaters if you can find it. That movie holds up, and the two, the protagonist and the antagonist never are on screen. They're on screen at the same time. They're never in the same room. That's how well written that film was. So hats off to Nicholas Meyer, the writer director. But I just think that there's got to be, some awareness on studio's part that, you can make a hard pivot. It's perfectly fine. Audiences will forgive you. And I think that they love Henry Cavill as Superman. So why not make a Man of Steel 2? Stop with all this hand wringing about what a small fraction of batshit crazy, immature morons on social media think. Just make a Superman movie, period. It'll make money. Look what Maverick. So, and there, I'm going to drop it there and love to hear everyone else's thoughts.
Well, I was just going to say on that note, people are still hung up on any of this Cavill coming back as a sign of the Snyderverse returning. Well, as you pointed out earlier, Chris, and we pointed out a few times too, Snyderverse has never technically left us. We're still technically in the Snyderverse. Right. And people are ignoring or forgetting the fact that David Zaslav said that they are doing a reset. That does not mean a reboot. What a reset is basically what we've been reporting now for the past, year, Andre, or better, that they will use the same characters, a lot of the same actors, but it'll be a completely different tone, a completely different storyline and universe, basically.
Yeah, but it will retain the continuity.
Yeah, so as a loose continuity. Yeah,
exactly. So we've always been saying, will the Snyderverse restored? Well, that depends on what you mean with the Snyderverse. If you mean, will Zack Snyder be back to do Justice League Part 2, Mad Max Batman, featuring teaming up with the Joker and taking on Darkseid. Will that happen? No, that won't happen. But will Henry Cavill be back as Batman? Will Ben Affleck, as Superman? Will Ben Affleck carry on as Batman for more movies? Yeah, probably. Yeah. If you're willing to accept that as the Snyderverse will carry on. Won't be restored because it never went away.
Well, right. I mean, if all you consider is the Snyderverse is just the casting, that's a very superficial way to look at it. But I look, and I have one question, just to return to Star Trek for a second, Chris. I have been telling Tom for a long time, and anybody who will listen to me, that when I went to the theater for the first time to see Star Trek, the motion picture, the sound editing and everything was terrible, especially the second half of the film.
Yes, there were lines, there were looped lines, there was stuff that was terrible. I mean, I saw it like 3 or 4 times in the theater. I mean, I was a kid, but it was interesting the way Star Trek was received as opposed to how Star Wars was received. Star Wars was a surprise. No one saw it coming. It just became a phenomenon. Yeah. And I'd been reading about a Star Trek movie in Starlog magazine since before Star Wars came out. Like they're going to make first, they're going to remember Star Trek Phase 2. They were going to do a second Star Trek
it was
series.
going to be a TV show. Yeah.
It was going to launch the Paramount Network, which didn't happen. So then all of that, I mean, that's why Star Trek, the motion picture, cost so much money and why effectively the movie became a bottle episode. They'd spent so much money developing Star Trek Phase 2 as a television series that when they finally got to make the movie, they just didn't have a lot of money left, but they did have Robert Wise, amazing director. So.
Well, and Culture does this to me all the time. He forgets, and I told him now. I've only seen the theatrical cut maybe 3 times in my life. Because when growing up, I had the TV version on tape. And then I got, of course, the DVD, which was the special director's edition from there. Mm-hmm. So like that he forgets that I've only seen the theatrical. Like I just watched it maybe a couple of years ago last year when the 4K came out. That's the first time I've seen the theatrical cut in I don't know how many years. Yeah. So like, yeah.
I've also only seen the theatrical cut once. That was the first time I saw the movie. Next time I saw the director's cut, I was blown away by it. I do love the director's cut. I saw the documentary of the changes just to get them further emphasized. Yeah, this is how you do it. Mm-hmm. This is how you make an upgrade. And I'm so happy that it's now in 4K.
Well, Robert Weiss is lucky that he got to do that. Yeah, because that's, especially at that time, was a rarity. And not only that, I always felt it was kind of the curse of Citizen Kane and Orson Welles getting because for those who don't know, Robert Weiss, who directed Star Trek the Motion Picture, had happened to him exactly what he played in part on Orson Welles on one of his films earlier on in his career. And Orson didn't talk to him for the rest of his life because of it. So I always felt like maybe it was part of that curse that Orson put upon him. That's where you pay for it, was Star Trek the Motion Picture.